For over 100 years, a great, unfinished cathedral had loomed over Florence. The original planners had been overly ambitious. They had meant to build the largest dome in the world, and they had failed.
The cathedral, more than any other building of any nature in a medieval and Renaissance city, represent the symbol of the identity of the community. And having the project not completed was a sort of mutilation. And without a dome, you don't have a sacred building.
All contemporary building knowledge had been exhausted. Now, the city looked for fresh ideas from a new generation. Cosimo de' Medici had grown up in the shadow of the cathedral. Now, he and his father stood on the threshold of civic power. Perhaps they could apply their enterprising spirit to the greatest problem of the age, and in the process win glory and power for the Medici family. The search for a solution to the problem of the dome led men to study the achievements of the classical past. Scholars like Cosimo knew it would take an unconventional mind to decipher the tantalizing clues. Through the streets of Florence roamed just such a man, a self-taught genius obsessed by the mysteries of the ancient world. His ideas were difficult to understand. His name was Filippo Brunelleschi.
I think that the G word of genius is something that people are reluctant to use these days, but I think is very applicable in the case of Brunelleschi. However, maybe like many geniuses, he wasn't someone you would necessarily want to know.
Brunelleschi's style was unorthodox, and it gained him few friends.
He was in many arguments with the so-called city fathers. On one occasion, he was actually carried out of the main government palace forcibly because he'd lost his temper and apparently he'd insulted people and they were not going to be insulted and they threw him out.
But the family, who had sponsored a pirate for a pope, were not daunted by the temper of a maverick architect. In the Medici, Brunelleschi had found patrons willing to gamble on his judgment. Brunelleschi's vision would resurrect forgotten concepts of the past. And in 1419, a new orphanage in Florence became a showcase for his ideas and for Medici ambition.
Brunelleschi was using the classical orders of architecture, something that hadn't been used in over 1,000 years. And the people of Florence were so amazed by this that it's said that they gathered on the building site, much to the inconvenience of the workmen, and actually watched this happening because they simply hadn't seen anyone build in that style before.
This was the first time True columns have been used for structural support since the days of ancient Rome. Out of Brunelleschi's turbulent mind had come a vision of classical simplicity. He would spark an architectural revolution across Europe. Innovation and ambition went hand in hand. And for the Medici, this was only the beginning.
Brunelleschi was the house architect. They were very close. There was a clear fit between what Cosimo wanted and what Brunelleschi could give him. And it very much was about recreating a great classical city on the lines of Rome.
The Medici family did the sorts of things that every ruling family did. You try to get power by various public and private dealings, and then you try to promote your image to the rest of the world through art and literature and having people write about you, being a patron of things that can serve your ends.
With the backing of the Medici, Brunelleschi now set his eye on the problem of the dome, the greatest challenge in Florence. Brunelleschi set to work. Cosimo would publicly support him. The church authorities were desperate, offering a massive cash prize for a solution. Brunelleschi's model showed the largest unsupported dome in Christendom. But he was fearful his ideas would be stolen. He wrote his calculations in code and refused to explain the details of his plan. The cathedral authorities demanded some kind of demonstration before they would award the prize. So Brunelleschi challenged them to stand an egg on its end. When they failed, Brunelleschi broke the bottom of the egg, and it stood up. The men complained that his solution was so obvious. Brunelleschi protested. Of course it was, and so would be the solution to the dome if he showed them his plans. The authorities gave in to the stubborn architect. The commission for the dome was his. But what Brunelleschi would now attempt was unprecedented and fraught with danger. He would have to rewrite the rules of Western architecture, and there was no certainty of success. For inspiration, Brunelleschi turned to the greatest civilization of the ancient world. And in Brunelleschi's wake came Cosimo, the papal banker, anxious to see things for himself. In ancient Rome, men had constructed architectural marvels. Buildings such as the Pantheon, the House of the Gods, the largest freestanding dome in the world.
One of the most fascinating buildings in ancient Rome was definitely the Pantheon. It was one of the most fascinating buildings in the collective imagination of the Western world for a long time. It was really something to be absorbed and assimilated in order to appropriate the techniques of the building, but also the spirit that the dome was expressing.
Brunelleschi saw valuable clues in the Pantheon's design.
He wanted to discover not only the proportions of it, but also the nuts and bolts of how it was built.
What particularly struck the contemporaries was the size of the dome. and the fact that it was one of the very few complete domes that had survived from ancient times.
The architects of ancient Rome had framed the Pantheon with timber and poured their concrete dome over the top. But there was not enough timber in all of Tuscany to build a scaffold inside Florence Cathedral. Brunelleschi's dome would have to support itself throughout the building process. Even the recipe for concrete had been lost since the fall of Rome. But through intense study, the Pantheon gave up its secrets to Brunelleschi. He was inspired by its clever double skin. So Brunelleschi used the idea of the Pantheon's strong circle, placing an inner dome within the cathedral's octagonal drum. Sandstone rings would hold the structure together like a barrel. It was an ingenious and completely original idea. In practice, however, Brunelleschi was entering uncharted territory. When Cosimo returned to Florence, work on the dome had begun.
You would have the sound of the hammers, you would have the workmen in the streets, beckoned by the bells that summoned them from their beds. It was a scene of chaotic activity, sort of like New York in the 1920s or something, when the first skyscrapers are going up. Brunelleschi came fresh to building sites with his own ideas. The workers ate their lunches up on the dome because he didn't want them descending in the middle of the day to go and have their lunch, because then they would be exhausted by the time they got back up the 350, 400 odd steps. But he also served wine to them because that was really the drink that you had in Florence, much safer than water. But he did make certain that your wine was diluted. You put a third part water in, which was the drink that was given to pregnant women at the time.
Meanwhile, Brunelleschi also tried to escape the limitations of his age.
Brunelleschi was not only an architect, he was an engineer. He had to solve enormous logistical problems when he was building the dome. Foremost among the problems was how to raise sandstone beams weighing 1,700 pounds, 250 feet in the air. What he devised was unprecedented in the history of engineering. Oxen had great strength, great stamina, but you could not make them walk backwards for more than a few steps. So what Brunelleschi devised was a way of reversing a gear. So he could raise a load several hundred feet in the air, change gear, and then bring the hook back down so that the oxen only ever walked counterclockwise or clockwise, whichever he wanted.
But there was still no guarantee that Brunelleschi's intricate design would stand up. The city of Florence was nervous, and no one more anxious than Cosimo. His patronage of Brunelleschi was well known. Nothing could please Cosimo's enemies more than to see Brunelleschi fail. The Medici Bank was now the most profitable business in Europe. But wealth had never been enough for Cosimo. He began to commission the finest craftsmen of his age.
Cosimo developed a strategy in spending money in such a way that wealth would be transformed into prestige and power.
Cosimo de' Medici became the most sought-after patron in Florence.
Cosimo spent 600,000 golden florins in patronage. which is 6 times the total state entry for 1 year. Patronage is great for the production of art, but totally irrational from an economic point of view. Patronage is a political strategy. This, in my opinion, is one of the keys to understand the Renaissance. This high political competition expressed through patronage in a city with those art potentialities gave birth to an art market that has no equivalent elsewhere in Italy at the time.
Why the artist needs the patron is very simple. There are no public art markets in the Renaissance as we have today. You didn't make art and then put it in the shop window and wait for someone to buy it. You only made art when somebody commissioned it from you and paid you for it more or less in advance.
Cosimo tolerated his temperamental artists because of their talent, and their talents were now widely recognized.
You have to be difficult as an artist in these times because you are under a lot of pressure. 70% of the Renaissance artists were active in Florence at the time. Though there are a lot of patrons, there is a lot of money available. Not all of the projects would grant the same kind of dignity and visibility to the artist, who has to self-promote himself and who has to achieve certain standards of credibility and fame in order to be able to be put in charge of the best projects.
The man working on the best project in Florence was Filippo Brunelleschi, and he continued to break boundaries of conventional understanding. He simply saw the world as no other man had. In 1434, Brunelleschi unveiled a new technique that radically changed Western art. He invented perspective.
Brunelleschi developed linear perspective, which allowed pictures to create the convincing illusion of a three-dimensional space, where Gothic art is primarily flat, to represent objects as three-dimensional, rounded, solid forms, imitating the appearance of the natural world.
Perspective revolutionizes everything. It revolutionizes art, but then, of course, it revolutionizes how we see completely. It creates a modern way of looking, but it begins in the 15th century, and it very much begins under Cosimo with Brunelleschi.
No one in Florence was taking more risks than Brunelleschi. His magnificent dome was rising even higher. But with each new brick, the angle of the dome increased. This was the critical phase of Brunelleschi's design.
One of the major problems Brunelleschi faced when he was building the dome, and particularly when he got to the upper reaches of it, was how he could prevent the bricks from falling inwards. What Brunelleschi did was to insert bands of vertical brickwork to tie the horizontal courses to these vertical ones, which were keyed to courses 5, 6 rows beneath that, where the mortar had dried.
Brunelleschi's herringbone design was untried and untested. The slightest miscalculation could result in catastrophic failure.
It would have been a disaster, but I would say not as much a disaster in terms of not completing an architectural project, but a disaster in failing in producing the most grandiose symbol of Florentine pride ever.
From his patrons to his workers, All looked on in disbelief. Brunelleschi had to prove that he was right.
Brunelleschi was a very hands-on person. Not only did he inspect many of the bricks that were used and send consignments back if they weren't quite up to snuff, he also actually laid some of the bricks himself. The workers weren't certain at all that this was a viable proposition to lay these on an inward curving vault. And so he himself went up and practiced what he preached.
The genius of Brunelleschi had defied all doubt and danger.
And in 1436, Brunelleschi, who has been keeping the faith all this time, that he could build that dome without aid of scaffolding or any other visible support, has brought, as he writes in a little poem he wrote, this miracle to pass. Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah,
hallelujah. This great achievement had mirrored the rise of the city's most powerful family. And now it towered majestically over the city of Florence, the greatest architectural feat in the Western world. Cosimo basked in the dome's reflected glory, inviting the Pope himself to conduct the consecration. If Cosimo could have looked into the future, he would have seen the story of the Renaissance unfold on the ceiling of the dome itself. Weighing 37,000 tons and using more than 4 million bricks, Brunelleschi's dome was proof that man could conquer the seemingly impossible. A friend of Cosimo's wrote of its impact.
It touches the skies and casts its shadow over the whole of Tuscany.